So if it's all right, I'm just going to jump right in. So yes, I'm an assistant professor in the history of the Middle East and Africa at SOAS at the University of London. I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. And what I'm going to be talking about is some major changes that took place across the Ottoman world, specifically the Ottoman Egyptian world in the 19th century. And I'm going to do that through the perspective, the slightly unconventional perspective, of a rebel movement in Sudan called the Mahdist movement. Now, in 1881, Sudan was the site of one of the biggest imperial rebellions of the late 19th century, the Mahdist uprising. So this was an uprising led by a man called Muhammad Ahmad. He declared himself the Mahdi, in other words, the eschatological redeemer of mankind. And he declared that it was the end of times. It may be something that some of us can relate to nowadays. So he called for a rebellion against the, I quote, Turks, so the Ottoman Egyptian government of Sudan, which had ruled Sudan for 60 years, and he declared that they were infidels. In 1884, the Mahdists succeeded in expelling not only the Ottomans, but all European forces from Sudan. And they did this at the height of the scramble for Africa. So they managed to actually establish an independent state in Sudan, just as the rest of the continent was being colonized. News of this spectacular victory spread like wildfire from Nigeria to India. And of course, it sparked a lot of imperial anxiety. And unsurprisingly, the Mahdist state that lasted for 15 years, as I said, was subjected to concerted attacks by the British, who attacked it from Upper Egypt, so from the border with Egypt, and from the Red Sea. And in 1898, the British finally succeeded in overthrowing the Mahdists and claiming Sudan as a British colony. Now, why did this uprising take place? And why do we know so little about it? Were these people just a bunch of messianic fanatics? If not, if they weren't just fanatics, why did the Mahdi call the Ottomans of all people, the leaders of the Muslim community, infidels, kuffar? So this seems like a bit of a paradox. Were these the words of a madman? Now, it's my contention, it's something I explore in my research, that this moment, this rebellion has been too quickly dismissed. Or when it has been taken seriously, it's been seen through quite anachronistic lenses, right? So it's been seen through a binary framework. It was either this purely religious uprising, again, a sort of a bunch of sort of fanatics and of interest to scholars of religion, or it was an economic backlash. People were being overtaxed. And so religion was just an expression of a deeper economic anxiety. Now, I think it was more than this. And it was something that superseded this binaristic framing. And I think that looking at the archives of the Mahdist rebellion and similar rebellions allows us to find a kind of a perceptive critique of an emerging Ottoman order, a new form of colonial modernity that was unfolding in the region. But to understand their critique requires us to examine more closely the regime that they were trying to overthrow. So in this case, the Ottoman regime or the Ottoman Egyptian regime. So it requires us to take a step back. And so in the first part of this lecture, what I'd like to do is to examine some elements of transformation in the Ottoman Empire that I think were the subject of critique of these Mahdists. So specifically changes to land and changes to law. And in the second part of the presentation, I will then return to the Mahdist rebellion and its own vision of a new order. So there we have the Mahdi on the screen there. Right. So I want to talk about property in the Ottoman Empire. Now, the history of the Middle East more broadly, like much of the rest of the global South, is often told in terms of a series of absences. So absences that have hindered its development, that have led to it falling behind the West, And one of these absences, or supposed absences, is private property. So private property is considered a foundation stone of the free market and crucial for things like credit, which of course is needed for economic growth. So its supposed absence in the Middle East is usually attributed to the excessive space taken up by the state, which in Orientalist writings is presented as bloated and despotic and dominating. Land in the Middle East is considered property of the state, it's publicly owned. And society, on the other hand, or we might say the market, struggles to free itself from the grip of this all-encompassing state. So the conventional narrative is that the attempt to free private property from the state began in the Middle East through a series of reforms that the Ottoman Empire undertook, which instituted private property and asked people to formally register their lands in their names. Unfortunately, these reforms were largely unsuccessful since many smallholders didn't register their properties. And so it was finally only when the British came and the French came, when this was done properly, when land began to be organized and a market instituted. So colonial rule comes in and regularizes private property. So that's the conventional account. And I think there are many problematic assumptions that go into this. For a start, these accounts don't question private property itself. So they don't question the normativity, that is, whether private property is a good thing or a bad thing. It's simply assumed to be a good thing. Secondly, they don't ask how conceptions of private property might have changed over time. And thirdly, and this is something I'm going to be focusing on quite a bit, is that they constantly reproduce a set of binaries that perhaps don't really apply to the regions that we're studying. So the binary between state and society, the public and the private. So these spheres are taken for granted. And so private property is understood to be in that second sphere, right? In the private, in society. So by contrast, I want to ask if we can explore the question of property in the Middle East without deploying these binary frameworks. And moreover, to ask, what if it wasn't the absence of private property, but rather its emergence that has been the cause of hardship and dispossession in the region? Mm. Or in the words of Timothy Mitchell, was the violence of property making also the violence of nation making? The mid-19th century Ottoman Empire saw some important changes in the realm of property through a series of reforms that the empire underwent called the Tanzimat, or literally the reorganizations. In conventional narratives of the Ottoman Empire, the empire was facing this long decline, funnily enough, all the way from the 16th century, so very, very long decline. And by the end of the 18th century was also faced with political fragmentation as provincial rulers grew in strength, and it was beginning to lose some major military battles to European powers. And so there was this strong desire to build stronger militaries that operated more efficiently, as seen in European countries, and to generally institute a broader societal reform. Hence the Tanzimat, beginning in 1839. So these reforms are usually understood to have been westernizing in nature, to be modeled on Europe. And so one of the consequences of this, it is argued, was that there was finally a registration of a regularization of taxation and property rights. So again, we're still within this sort of conventional narrative. But instead of seeing this as an attempt at imposing efficiency and order, I argue that this should be seen as the Ottoman state bringing about new forms of control and ensuring greater extraction. So it was a form of reorganization that brought into effect new relations of power and violence, not as a result of the reforms failing to live up to themselves, but precisely to the extent that they actually succeeded. So taxation, we have an image of the Tanzimat edict right there on the screen there for you. Now, taxation had previously relied on a system of tax farming, which is basically a method of collecting taxes, which relies on provincial elites buying the right to collect taxes by paying for it upfront. And this exists not just in the Ottoman Empire, but in Egypt, in Safavid Iran, in Qajar Iran. And the problem was that this was considered a leaky system, right? So a lot of the revenue is sort of siphoned off by tax farmers. And so given the need to now fund more powerful militaries, this siphoning off was seen as a problem. And so the Tanzimat sought to impose a more direct form of taxation. And so one of the ways it tried to do this, or the reforms tried to do this, was precisely through land reform. So land relations were reorganized and a regime of individual ownership was brought about. Rather than this being seen as private property, so a kind of success of individuals gaining their rights against the state, this was actually very much a state project. This was about the government making it absolutely clear who on each plot of land was responsible for making sure taxes were paid. And it was brought about precisely by this Ottoman Land Code of 1858. And I think it is worth noting that all of this happened off the heels of the Ottoman Empire's defeat in the Crimean War in 1853. The war was 1853 to 1856. And this isn't only important because the Ottoman fleet was, it suffered badly and was destroyed and needed to be rebuilt, but the treasury was in trouble. So the empire was nearly bankrupted due to these war expenses. And it was around this time also that the empire turned to European financial capital and started to take out loans. So this move towards regularizing land and bringing about private ownership needs to be seen in this context of, I suppose, increasing indebtedness. So methodologically speaking, I think, or in terms of how we frame these histories, I don't think we can simply talk about the emergence of private property in the Ottoman Empire as if it was this, firstly, a battle waged by society against the state, one which society ultimately won. But nor should we think about it simply in terms of a Western idea that infiltrates into the East. In fact, it's very much, or scholars have argued, it's very much to do with the Ottoman state itself. It was a state project. And so rather than thinking in terms of West and East, we need to think about transformations of governmental power and state power within a single frame. So here we go. Secondly, I think it's worth using Ottoman history to also rethink some of liberalism's arguments regarding the development of private property. So these, of course, are also premised on a strict separation between state and society, one which has been constructed by political economists and jurists in the 18th and 19th century. So property belongs to the societal domain, and it is the central institution of the market economy, which obviously makes possible exchange of resources, of land, labor, goods, and so on. It's worth noting that there are disagreements amongst liberal thinkers about the origins of private property. So some take up a naturalist argument. They believe that private property has always existed, whilst others take up a historicist argument, believing that there's a relationship between private property and histories of commercial expansion. So it's sort of merchants and commercial classes that free property from the legal obstacles that restrict its free circulation. However, these narratives don't take into account, again, the power of the state, since according to liberals, the state isn't about private interests, it's about general interests, it's the sphere of the universal. That it's these kinds of separations that have also been mapped onto other disciplines. So we have a separation between private law, which is sort of the formalization of market relations, and public law, which regulates the administrative practices of the state. It's precisely these fictional separations that historical work should challenge by presenting actual histories of the development of private property. And when we do that, we can see that property was very much part of the emerging and developing practices of the state, including new forms of law, registration, cadastral surveying, and mapping. These weren't just reflections of the market, but themselves new forms of governmental power and new techniques of extraction. So how did the state implement this in the Ottoman context? Before delving a little bit deeper into this, I think we need to remember that older ways of thinking about property, if I can call them that, it's sort of heuristic to say that, were quite different. So there was a shift in the way property was understood in the 19th century. So this was from an understanding of property not as an object to be owned, right, as a relationship between a thing and a person. Instead, property was often considered a site of multiple obligations and relations. So mostly property relations involved different rights to extract revenue from the land. So whether it be the Sultan, whether it be provincial elites, to peasants, to nomads, everybody had a different right to extract revenue from the land. It was often the site of customary rights. So some people would have grazing rights to a piece of land, and for certain parts of the year, others would be entitled to half the fruit of a given tree. The tax farmer might be entitled to a certain proportion of the crop grown on land. Another person might be allowed to have their animals drink from a stream. So there were a cluster of rights and obligations. And so it's no surprise that land in Islamic legal tracts and many other writings is often not defined by who owns it, but by the kind of revenue that can be extracted from it. So this was to shift with the Tanzimat and the Ottoman Land Code in 1858, which categorized land as being owned by different groups in terms of ownership. The three major categories are miri land, often defined as state land, mulk or freehold, and waqf, charitable endowments. The mid-19th century Ottoman state called for a survey and registration of lands and the issuance of title deeds. Those who couldn't prove ownership of their land, of course, lost their land. And many people, especially smallholders and peasants, fearing greater taxation from the state or even conscription, actively avoided registering their lands or registered them in the name of local elites. And that later led to their dispossession. And of course, this is a big part of the story of land in Palestine. But most importantly, property was reconceptualized, recast increasingly as a relationship between a person and a thing. And now that thing could be sold and others could be excluded from it. More importantly, it meant that a single person had absolute right to extract revenue from a piece of land. Crucially, as a result of this, a single person was also responsible to pay taxes to the state on that land. Now, I won't have too much time to go into this, but the story is, of course, even more complicated than this. This easy division between sort of state land and private land, miri versus mulk, that's not so simple either, as I think the Mitchell reading shows, and we're going to be talking about that in a second, because the first lands that were actually registered by the Ottoman state weren't the mulk, not the ones that we understand to be individually owned, but in fact, miri lands, what we understand to be state lands. But even in this context, state really meant land that the ruler had a revenue claim on, but which was often in fact held by different people, so members of the ruler's family or other elites. So again, we need to be a little bit careful here and avoid the Eurocentrism of assuming that miri neatly maps onto state land and mulk neatly maps on to privately owned land. Now, I think Mitchell, moving us to specifically Ottoman Egypt, which is of relevance to Sudan because it was Ottoman Egypt that invaded Sudan and occupied Sudan. I think Mitchell makes this point in a very interesting way. He opens up by laying out some interesting connections between private property, and ideas of civilization. He argues that the East was regarded as a space of despotism and arbitrary power, where decisions were made on the basis of habit, custom, and the whim of the ruler. This arbitrary power was violent. But on the other hand, in the West, European civilization, this was governed by fundamental principles. These were principles derived from reason, and therefore they were universal and were applicable everywhere, true in every country. Private property was one of these principles. So he contrasts the universality of the principle of private property with the arbitrary way in which the Khedive of Egypt would assign property to his subjects. But he goes on to actually unpack this binary framing, these assumptions. Spaces in which private property did not exist, ironically, spaces in which private property did not exist were, from the European perspective, by definition, spaces of barbarism. Ironically, this precisely justified taking over this land in order to bring progress and private property through colonization. So this is how French settlers justified seizing land in Algeria, taking over the land because it lacked private property. And similarly, Locke, whose work, of course, is a bastion of liberal political theory, who proclaimed the importance of the defense of life, liberty, and property by the state, was also a British colonial official and settler in the North and South Carolinas. In his labor theory of property, he argued that a lack of labor on the land, so a lack of settled agricultural labor, signaled a lack of private property, as labor on land proved ownership. And so this meant that Native American land could be seized and colonized because it wasn't actually owned. So the liberal theory of property is also a bastion of settler colonialism. The principle of property was ironically framed as the opposite of coercion, violence and power, and yet it was established by violence. So Mitchell offers us a critique of the idea that the rule of law and that private property arrived in Egypt as an abstract set of ideas and imposed order on this disordered society. It's not so simple as this. So what happens when we tell histories of the development of private property as it actually happened? What are the silences that the history of private property has often produced? Now, I'm going to go into this history a little bit through the work of Mitchell. So, as we know, Egypt was ruled from 1804 by Muhammad Ali, an Ottoman soldier from Albania, who had arrived in Egypt at the behest of the Sultan to expel the French and and to re-establish control in the province. Muhammad Ali and his dynasty would go on to rule Egypt as an autonomous province of the empire until the British reoccupied in 1882. And although he's been seen as the founder of modern Egypt, he in fact, of course, didn't see himself as Egyptian. He had expansionist aims. He invaded Sudan in 1821, and he built a strong, modernized army in order to secure his own lineage. And when the Europeans saw that he was getting too powerful, of course, they curbed his power, both militarily and also by banning the use of monopolies over goods like cotton. Now, Mitchell retells the story of private property in terms of the problem faced by the rulers of Egypt, so Muhammad Ali and his descendants. And he begins specifically with the problem of production. So how to grow crops that would bring in large amounts of wealth, how to grow cotton, opium, sugar, indigo. Muhammad Ali knew that Europeans were able to flourish as capitalists as a result of growing cash crops in their colonies, and they used the specific technology of the slave plantation. But how was he going to reproduce this in Egypt? Muhammad Ali attempted to import enslaved people from Sudan, but this was a terrible failure. And most Egyptians in Egypt were not willing to grow what they couldn't actually eat. So how to make people produce what he wanted them to produce. And there are three aspects of this history of private property that Mitchell points out for us. And I'm going to go through them very, very quickly. So first, how to make people work. Secondly, the need for eliminating autonomous communities and autonomous spaces. And finally, the building of large estates. So firstly, how to make people work. When people in the countryside were made to work on cotton plantations or to work on building large infrastructure projects like irrigation projects, their simple response was to flee. So they would just flee to another piece of land. And so the response to this by Egypt's rulers was to enact a series of laws to make this harder. So this included registering the name of deserters, or making local officials responsible for the tax arrears of people who'd fled, and later gradually eliminating people's rights to abandoned land, even customary rights, and ultimately, in fact, appropriating the land of people who had fled. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about spaces of autonomous political organization. Now, before the middle of the 19th century, most people in the Nile Valley, beyond the reach of Cairo, did live in autonomous political communities. And so these have sometimes been called Bedouin communities. They have sometimes been referred to as Arab or Arabs. But this kind of suggests that they were all nomads. But in fact, many of these people were living in villages, but happened to rule themselves autonomously. Their lands were rarely registered or taxed, but they merely sent a tribute to the center. In the mid-19th century, the Mehmed Ali dynasty began eliminating these autonomous zones, and therefore zones that people could flee to and escape to. So their lands were either taken as government land, registered, or settled, as turned into villages. And so the third point that I think he lays out very well for us is in relation to the establishment of large agricultural estates. So when Muhammad Ali's grandson, Ismail, came into power in 1863, he began expanding a system of large estates, which he and his family had developed in the south of Egypt to grow cotton and sugar. So he expanded this to other areas of Egypt. Peasants who had increasingly come to be dispossessed of their lands for the reasons just mentioned were now forced to work in these large estates. The estates themselves often had their own villages where workers were disciplined and organized. They were spaces of violence, and the rule of the head of the estate was essentially the law. So why is this interesting? This is interesting for many reasons. One of which I don't have time to go into, is the extent to which production was being reorganized in quite a sophisticated way in the Egyptian countryside, something that is actually comparable to the Industrial Revolution, the reorganization of production and the management and disciplining of labor that we see in Europe. But here it's happening in the Egyptian countryside. But the second reason why it's interesting is that rather than showing private property to be the opposite of arbitrary power, it was in these estates that we see arbitrary power at its strongest. And these large estates ultimately became consolidated under British rule as privately owned as private property. So now that we've seen how transformations in property were key to the modernization project of Muhammad Ali in 19th century Egypt, I want to touch very briefly on another series of modern reforms that took place in this space, this time regarding law. The historian Khalid Fahmy, in his recent book, In Quest of Justice, has examined in detail the Egyptian legal system of the 19th century. Whereas most sort of the conventional account has been that the Egyptian legal system, usually reduced to Sharia or Islamic law, was relatively static until European influence towards the end of the 19th century, Fahmy has argued that, in fact, the 19th century saw an exceptional period of dynamism, of legal sort of flourishing and transformation, leading to the development of this vast juridical apparatus. Now, this juridical apparatus was composed of two halves. So a system of Sharia courts on the one hand, and a system of administrative councils, or majalis, on the other hand. The administrative councils were implementing a form of law known as siyasa. So we have Sharia courts and siyasa councils. So this bifurcated system actually worked to reinforce each other. In the book, he very interestingly describes the use of and the development of forensic medicine to deal with certain forms of crime in the 19th century. But what's important here for our purposes is the fact that what we're seeing is a new form of governmental power, the development of a vast and actually quite hierarchical infrastructure composed of local courts, local councils, regional councils, courts of appeal, and the equivalent of a kind of Supreme Court in Cairo. Fahmy argues that this was the basis of an indigenous form of legal modernity, one which emerged quite independently of European influence. So to move to the final section of this presentation, how did Sudan, Egypt's colonial possession, respond to this moment? Oh, before we go into that, just to show you some examples of land contracts from a collection that I've been working with during this period. So we saw a land sales contract here. We've got a debt contract for the mortgage of land. Okay. Okay, so to return to Sudan, these transformations that we've been talking about with respect to Egypt, so both in terms of property and also in terms of law, for the most part, were also brought to its colony, Sudan. Muhammad Ali's armies invaded in 1821. And when they did, they brought down the Sultanate of Sennar, which had ruled large parts of present-day Sudan since the 16th century. Sometimes they're referred to as the Funj Sultanate, after the name of the dynasty. And their capital was on one of the banks of the Nile. So the Nile splits in two. We have the Blue Nile and the White Nile, which meets as it goes into Egypt. And on the banks of the Blue Nile was the Sultanate of Sennar. Now, going back to the invasion, British historiography has had this incentive, I suppose, to portray the Ottoman Egyptian period in Sudan as one of extreme anarchy and despotism and violence, and one based on the complete absence of law. And the reason why the historiography has done this is because this aided in the reoccupation of Sudan in 1898, when they took it back from the Mahdists, and in justifying it, justifying keeping it as a British colonial possession instead of returning it to the Ottomans. But contrary to this historiography that is portrayed the Ottoman Egyptian period in Sudan as one of kind of unending violence and anarchy, the Egyptians actually installed a complex legal apparatus like the one I've just described in Sudan. Whilst the Sharia wasn't by any means new to Sudan, so the concept of sort of Islamic law and courts and so on, they existed under the Sultanate of Sennar. This was the first time that the Sharia would be implemented and enforced through the violent apparatuses of an increasingly centralized state. Qadis or judges were trained in Cairo, and their judgments were monitored by the same hierarchy of courts, with the Supreme Court being in Cairo. This reorganization of Islamic law detached it from the lived world in which it was embedded, and instead rendered it something applied in a centralized and increasingly uniform way. At the same time, individual ownership allowed the government to tax more intensively and to make sure that land in Sudan also fell into the hands of people who could produce cash crops on it. Unsurprisingly, cultivators in Sudan quickly fell into debt and began to lose their lands. People who tried to desert, who tried to flee, found fewer and fewer spaces away from the administrative apparatuses of the state to escape to. Moreover, this new regime of courts, the Sharia courts and the Siyasa councils, actually encouraged people to treat land as individually owned and enforced things like foreclosures for failures to pay debts and so on. So whilst there's been this tendency to portray this Ottoman Egyptian moment in Sudan, this rule as an era of despotism and maladministration and violence, it was rather very much a period of administration. There was violence, of course, but this didn't take place due to an absence of the law, but precisely through its presence, through its intensified presence, and through a new modern disciplinary form of domination. I now want to turn to the person who I believe had some important insights on this moment and on the transformations that were taking place in this time. So the Mahdi, the quintessential figure of the fanatic, or at least that was the case for a very long time in the British sort of colonial imaginary. In 1881, at the pinnacle of Egypt's own debt crisis under Ismail, Muhammad Ali's grandson, and only months before British fleets bombarded and occupied Alexandria, a Sufi from northern Sudan declared himself the Messiah, the expected Mahdi, the redeemer of mankind, and called for a jihad, or an insurgency, against Ottoman Egyptian rule. And he branded those Ottomans infidels. Now, he was appointed the Mahdi in a dream, in the presence of the Prophet Muhammad, the angel of death, various dignitaries and Sufi sheikhs from every order, and Khidr, the mystical itinerant prophet, who, according to Quranic revelation, took Moses on a journey with him through time, showing him things that he could not possibly understand. So it was in the presence of this illustrious audience that the prophet confirmed the Mahdi's appointment and told him that the hour was near, that it was the beginning of the end of time. Justice would have to be restored to the world, and the Sharia, which had been corrupted at the hands of the infidel Turks and the scholars who had vindicated them, would have to be renewed. Now, the Mahdi would recount this dream in dozens of letters sent to various notables and sheikhs, not just in Ottoman Sudan, but in the wider Islamic world. As we know, he would go on to lead a rebellion ousting the Ottomans. And the Mahdi's followers, peasants armed initially only with spears and sticks, would defeat not one, but two powerful empires of the time, the Ottomans and the British. And as I've mentioned, at the height of the scramble for Africa, Mahdist rebels went on to establish an independent government that lasted 15 years. This spectacle shook the Ottoman and European imperial worlds, but this was less on account of their military strength than due to a fear of the spread of Mahdist sentiment across their empires. Because the disposition that Mahdism called for, which was one of asceticism, of radical unity, and a focus on the present, we're talking about a messianic moment, this had the potential to supersede imperial boundaries. And so they feared it would spread like wildfire from Nigeria to India. And in fact, they had adherents from Nigeria and India. It's this dispossession that became the target of British counterinsurgency when they finally defeated the Mahdists. And so although the Mahdists were ultimately defeated at the battlefield at the hands of British forces, this spectre of Mahdist sentiment, so pregnant with the possibility of eruption, haunted British administrators and bubbled well into the first decades of the 20th century. Now, it's not only interesting to recount a kind of political history of the Mahdist movement, Because the Mahdist movement wasn't just a successful anti-colonial rebellion, this sort of singular event that we can recount as a chronological segment in the history of empire and resistance to it. It also left this unusual, if not unique, conceptual repository. Unlike many subaltern rebellions and many sort of peasant movements, the Mahdists were actually prolific, both before and after their success. And so they've left behind this voluminous archive, not just a rebel archive, and I think that alone would make it very interesting. It's unique because it's a messianic archive. It operated in a particular temporal plane in messianic time, which as we know from political theorists, is precisely the time of political possibilities, or political possibility. And so it offers, I argue, an imaginary for a different mode of being, and it makes it a source of critique of the previous era. So I asked, what would it mean to treat this Mahdi as an intellectual, as someone who was critiquing Ottoman colonial modernity? So to demonstrate one or two of the critical insights offered by the Mahdist movement, I returned to one of the paradoxes that I opened with. So although the Ottoman Egyptian rulers of Sudan were the representatives of the Muslim community, although they had instituted this vast juridical apparatus of Sharia courts, of Islamic law courts, perhaps vaster than the region had ever seen, why did the Mahdi denounce them as infidels? He accused them of reducing, I quote, reducing Islam to its name and the Quran to a letter. So I want to take him seriously, to take his claim that they were infidels seriously. And what's interesting here is that, contrary to a lot of the colonial historiography and the Anglophone historiography, it was never the British and the Europeans that were the target of his critique. He wasn't calling them infidels. It was actually the Turks. It was the Ottoman Egyptians. So why was this the case? So the Mahdist archive offers a critique of these major changes to land and also to debt, actually related to land, and a critique that kind of moves beyond this division between religion and economics, or the religious and the economic. He argued that the Ottomans, despite having set up this network of courts, had altered the Sharia and started using it as an instrument of oppression. In their love of wealth, they had failed to realize that one's self-interest is inseparable from the interest of others, since believers, in the words of the Mahdi, are a single body. Thus, the debt regime that had been reinforced by these Sharia courts failed to realize that debts should be granted for God, and no interest from the land could be taken in return for their payment. He went on also to critique the regime of individual ownership that they had generalized, arguing that land does not belong to man, but to God, who bequeaths it to whomever he will amongst his servants. So the messianicity of this moment allowed him to be able to promulgate a new law, a new Sharia. And so we can see here another quote from the Mahdi. He says, the Mahdi determines that the limits that God has revealed for the Sharia, excuse me, there's a typo there. The Mahdi determines the limits that God has revealed for the Sharia and its revival. Its limits on cultivation must be upheld. No two people will quarrel in the area of cultivation. No one should claim to inherit land from his father and his ancestors in order to take from it income or to dislocate he who lives on it because of this. So here we see an expansive interpretation of ownership of the word mulk, which we've already seen, one which isn't exclusionary. There are several different examples. I want you to have a benefit that lasts, so whoever has land should farm on it, but if he's unable to farm it or does not need it, he should not take payment from those living on it, because the faithful are like one body, and what the faithful gives to his brother will remain on his scales forever before God. And indeed, upon their success, the Mahdists returned lands that were lost due to indebtedness, due to foreclosures, and forbade exclusion from the land. So was this a rebellion against Islam? Was this an economic rebellion? I mean, the easy answer is that it's both and neither. More accurately, it was a rebellion against these relatively new transactional approaches to land and debt, enforced by a centralizing legal juridical apparatus at the expense of a more ethical relationship. It was a rebellion against an approach to Islam that privileged transactional relations over ethical relations and had turned Islam, said it reduced it to a letter, had turned it into an instrument of abstraction. Now, in the last minute, I think it's interesting to note that this project of sort of returning land and also even debt back to a more ethical relationship also required quite radical transformation in the way people live their lives, in their own subjectivities. And I think it's in this context that some of the disciplinary injunctions of this messianic movement might be read. So, often they're dismissed as religious, Sufi, fanatical. But for instance, the Mahdist outfit, the jibba, which was famously made of woolen patches in the heat of Sudan, designed to be incredibly uncomfortable, is something that was understood to be equalizing, right, and sort of humbling. So again, I think it's interesting to think about how the binary frameworks of even religion and politics often prove quite unhelpful in understanding a political project such as this. So the aestheticism of the Mahdist sort of rituals was part of this larger political project of re-inculcating a more ethical relationship to land, to debt, and between different people. So my concluding thoughts from this very, very long presentation, I hope you're all still with me. These conceptual binarisms that we deploy in the social sciences and often in the humanities too, in history, I think often are more obfuscating than helpful. So moving beyond ideas of state versus society, public versus private, in our understanding of even something like property, allows us to see new things. For instance, it allows us in this case to see the new forms of disciplinary and governmental power that were emerging outside of spaces of European colonialism. So emerging in a place like the Ottoman Empire, in Ottoman Egypt. And this, of course, requires us to tell the actual and not just theoretical histories of political economic concepts. So like property, telling the actual histories of property rather than the theoretical ones. And equally, moving beyond the binary frameworks of religion versus economy or religion versus politics, I think also allows us to see interesting forms of political critique in archives and documents that I think people all too quickly dismiss or relegate to fields like Islamic studies or religious studies, including, of course, the archive and the writings of someone who claimed to be the Messiah. So I think I'm going to stop there.